Hello and welcome to the Power of Zero show. My name is David McKnight, best-selling author of The Power of Zero, Look Before You LERP, The Volatility Shield, and Tax-Free Income for Life, all of which can be bought in single copies on Amazon or wherever you buy fine books, or you can buy them in bulk. You can actually mix and match different purchases from different quantities of books and achieve bulk discounts at davidmcknightbooks.com. That's davidmcknightbooks.com. If you are looking for help to navigate all of the pitfalls that stand between you and the 0% tax bracket, and you want to mitigate longevity risk while you're at it, head over to davidmcknight.com. Happy to hook you up with a member of our Elite POZ Advisor Group. And if you are an advisor who wants to become a member of our Elite POZ Advisor Group, head on over to powerofzero.com. Very excited for our interview today. We will be interviewing Maya MacGuineas. She is the president of the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Her areas of expertise include budget, tax, and economic policy. As a leading budget expert and a political independent, she has worked closely with members of both parties and serves as a trusted resource on Capitol Hill. MacGuineas testifies regularly before Congress and is published broadly, including regularly in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Atlantic, and numerous other outlets. She also appears regularly as a commentator on television. Maya and I had a wide-ranging discussion. I loved it. It was one of the most sobering discussions I've had about the fiscal outlook in our country, but I thought that if there's anything that can arouse us to our faculties, it was this discussion. So sit back, relax, and take a listen to the part one of my interview with Maya MacGuineas. Maya MacGuineas, welcome to the Power of Zero show.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. For our listeners, Maya played a prominent role in our movie, The Power of Zero, The Tax Train is Coming. And we're grateful to have her on the show here today. Maya, you are the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Would you mind just taking a moment to discuss the origins of this committee and then some of what your objectives are?
Sure thing. The committee has been around for many decades now, many decades, and I'm one of the two people who run it, and I've run it for about the past 17 years. It came out of a number of members of Congress leaving after their experience in Congress, folks who've been parts of the budget committees and others, realizing how difficult it is to really govern in a quote unquote fiscally responsible manner, and I'll talk more about that, in what's also a political environment, because in many ways, those two things are completely at odds with each other. So fiscally responsible it's overly simplistic to say it's balanced budgets or things like that, but it's really the notion that you will be paying for many of your budgetary items yourself rather than asking someone else to pay for them, meaning the future or your kids, and borrowing in a way that is motivated by economic reasons, not political reasons. So there are indeed times you want to borrow, but usually when we're borrowing, it's not those times. And then there's a political pressure not to follow that basic principle, because it's really hard to actually do the work of fiscally responsible governing, which means not spending all the things you can think of money on, or paying for those things by raising revenues or cutting other spending. Politicians would much rather say, here's a bunch of things and they're free. And so there's a huge tension there. So basically the point was, can we get a lot of people who've been in government, the heads of many of the institutions, the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve System, the budget committees, the Office of Management and Budget or Congressional Budget Office, and they put together a committee that, and I think this is the most important part about it, is bipartisan. So they all have very different views about what the shape and size of government should look like, but they all think that we shouldn't shortchange the future by asking them to pay for all of our spending today. Again, with exceptions. We can talk about the huge pandemic we've just been through, which is the time when you should borrow. And they make up the board or the committee. And it's a wonderful group. The other side of that is the people who staff the committee. And it's some of the most talented, we call ourselves budget wonks, you'll ever meet in this city. And now, because of COVID, spread out around the country, in fact. And really, again, a diverse point of view about what they think government should or shouldn't do, but all committed to that basic mission of it's really important for the long-term safety of the economy and the country not to become dangerously over indebted.
Very, very good. Thank you for that prelude. So I'm going to just jump right into the question that I think my listeners probably are most interested in knowing is, what is your current assessment of our country's fiscal path?
Oh yeah, it's bad. There's no good way to look at that. It's really bad. Let me set the stage, and it's a depressing one. Right now, and again, let me frame it a little bit that there are times to borrow and there are times not to borrow. And we have just come out of one of those times to borrow, and borrow we did. We should borrow when the economy is really weak, in a recession, or when there's a huge emergency, and a global pandemic is textbook case of when you should be borrowing, other than that nobody really could have imagined a crisis like this where we had to shut down the entire economy. And we borrowed about $6 trillion in response. So, and that is money that was, for the most part, we thought was very smart to borrow. There was the last bill, which I had a lot of concerns about. But where we are right now, and unfortunately we were in a bad shape going into this downturn and all that borrowing, is that the debt as a share of GDP is higher or larger than the overall economy. It's above 100% of GDP, and it's about to eclipse the record we've ever seen in this country, which is 106% of GDP. That was right after World War II. Historically, the average has been about 40% of GDP, so we're well above that. The difference is the last time we were this high was right after a World War. Kind of understood why we had borrowed so much money. A war is another example of when it does and it can make sense to borrow. But very quickly after that, we ran balanced budgets for many of the years. Our economy grew like gangbusters. The baby boomers were in a part of the workforce, in their prime parts of the workforce, years where they were really contributing to growth. And we got that debt back down to historical levels in just a few years. The difference here is the trajectory we're on. We are slated to be running budget deficits, the amount you borrow every year, of well over $1 trillion, even once the economy has fully recovered, forever. And that debt to GDP is projected to grow faster than the economy forever. So it's going to hit about 113% of GDP in a year, or if you were to enact the president's budget, that would be closer to about 117% of GDP. Whatever the number is there, you see the trajectory is it's growing faster than the economy, which is basically the definition of when your debt is unsustainable. If your economy is growing faster than your debt, you probably are in a manageable position. That's what we'd like to see. We'd like to flip those two so that the economy is growing faster than the debt. And in order to do that, we've got to bring our deficits down, which would help bring our debt trajectory down.
Yeah, so we know that we have a debt problem in our country. And I remember about the same time last year, I think I remember posting on Facebook, we just hit, I don't know, it was maybe 23 trillion now, maybe it's 21 trillion actually. And now we just blew past 28 trillion. What do you think is driving the debt, and is it fixable?
So I think the bottom line here is, when I started working in this field and I was really worried about the economics of excessive debt, that was the concern, that high debt levels were going to lead to a crowding out of investment and not being prepared for emergencies. A lot of economic risks, effects on inflation or your currency, those risks all exist today. But the risks that we're dealing with are much larger than just the economic risks, and they're the external risks, the things that are potential threats to the country and the strength of the country, whether it's competition with China to be the strongest country out there, whether it's cyber attacks, which is something we're painfully aware of right now, whether it's shifts in technology. But the key to why we're not addressing either the debt or those bigger issues as effectively as we need to is polarization. And this is a really dangerous moment for this country, where we have become so divided and dysfunctional and distrustful of each other that we basically can get nothing done. And the reason that polarization is so directly related to the debt is that polarization is really the result of our two teams, our red and our blue team, intent on beating each other up so much to the extent that they would rather win the majority, win the next election, than worry about what they're getting past, getting accomplished in this election, if it were to mean compromising or allowing the other party to look better than it otherwise could. They'd rather beat the other party than do good for the country in so many ways. I mean, that's a big generalization, but it's really the unfortunate position of governing where we are right now. And one of the easiest ways to try to win over the public is to give them things for free. And that's why you have storylines. On the Republican side, it's tax cuts will pay for themselves. So they pass huge tax cuts and they don't pay for them. And they make up a story that they will pay for themselves, which they will not. Tax cuts will grow the economy if they're smart tax cuts, but they will certainly, most certainly not grow it anywhere close enough to actually pay for itself, generate as much revenue as it lost. On the Democratic side, there's always been the storylines of don't worry about these spending programs that are growing faster than the economy. That's fine. Those programs are health and retirement programs. They're okay. We shouldn't do anything. We shouldn't fix them, even though they're in trouble. And now there's a newer approach which says we can just print money. Don't worry about it. Those are the kinds of free lunch thinking that are appealing to the political parties when they're thinking about politics instead of economics, because they think, thank goodness, I can give a tax cut or I can give a new program and not have to pay for it. Whereas the hard work of paying for something is where it's very easy to campaign against that or make the case that that's, the other party's doing something bad. And it'll be an interesting test case because the Biden administration has just put out their new budget, very large expansion of spending. But to their credit, one of the things they talk about is how they would pay for that spending. Now they fall short. They don't pay for all of it. There's still a huge gap, but they do talk about a lot of tax increases. There's already resistance to those tax increases. And I would add they're the easiest tax increases to have because they're only on very high income people and corporations, which is hard in terms of, you're asking someone to pay for something, but it's really more of a very small sliver of the budget pie or people paying for all of the cost of the new initiatives. And so that's easier than actually a broad-based tax. So if we don't get a handle on the dividing us against them mentality and the ensuing approach to politics, which is let's give away as much as we can in pursuit of the majority, rather than focusing on good governance or long-term structural kind of serving as a fiduciary for the country, we will not be able to address this problem. Because in order to fix the debt, you have to focus on good policy, not good politics, and the long-term health of the country, and dealing with trade-offs and budgetary constraints and compromise. And those are the exact things that in this heavily polarized moment, politicians are running from. And that's a real problem, both for the federal debt, but much more broadly for the overall sustainable health of the country.
Yeah, you wrote a fascinating article that was posted to your website. I think it was in 2019. And the question that you asked in the title of your article was, can we sort of pay down the debt by simply taxing the top 1% of the country? And it was a fascinating article. You began by saying, look, we could, if all we wanted to do was simply prevent the debt from growing by, level off the growth, the rate at which the debt was growing to $1 trillion per year. And I want to make sure I don't mischaracterize your conclusions that we would have to tax anyone making more than $400,000 per year to the tune of something on the order of 103%, which is obviously nonsensical. Nobody would ever do that. The math, it's a major disincentive to do anything at all. So would you mind talking about what conclusions you drew from that study and what my listeners should know about what you were able to uncover?
Sure. So the first basic principle, simple principle is if something is worth paying for, figuring out how much it costs. I mean, if something is worth doing and you therefore willing to pay for it, looking at the cost and how much that would affect people is one of the ways you help decide that, right? Do we want new universal pre-K? Well, if it's free, of course we do. If it's 1 penny per taxpayer, we probably do. If it's $100, that has a different calculation, so on and so on. So figuring out first what the cost to taxpayers actually is a really huge piece about figuring out if something's worth it. And if you shift all of that cost onto somebody else, it basically always feels like it's free to us. And that helps, it kind of distorts that calculation of is it worth it? Because the whole notion of a budget, the reason you have one as a household or a company or a small nonprofit or a huge corporation is to figure out how you're going to allocate your resources, what your priorities are, and how you're going to deal with those inherent trade-offs. And so this is another attempt to make everything feel like it's free. But the truth is there isn't enough money in the pockets of the very, very wealthy areas of the economy if we also want to expand the government. And usually the people who are saying we want to just tax this one share, millionaires and billionaires, also have some very large programs that they would want to extend. I think one way to think about it is if you wanted to stabilize the debt, so it just stopped growing, but it stayed around where it is, a little bit above 100% of GDP. Again, 2.5 times the historical average, higher than I think makes sense for sure, but it's a lot more manageable than if it keeps growing. That would take about $4 trillion in savings. That right there is probably close to the upper limit of what you can credibly get from high-income people making over 400,000 and increases in corporate taxation. There's maybe a few trillion more, so you could do a little bit more, but it's not enough to bring the debt down to a manageable level. And it's certainly not enough to expand the kinds of programs that people are talking about when they say universal these new programs, huge new infrastructure, huge new human capital. There just isn't going to be enough to both control your debt and pay for those things if your limit is over 400,000. I just got off a fun roundtable that we do every year with people who are focused on the budget. We analyze the president's budget. And across the board, across the spectrum, everybody who talked about it at least felt concerned about this promise of not to raise taxes on people making more than $400,000 because it just overly constrains the government, much less able to do the things that you might want to do. And so if you want to talk about new government programs, you have to understand universal broad-based taxes are going to be part of the picture. Even if you don't want to, even if you want to just get the debt under control, it's very hard to do that without taxes that hit the middle class as well, whether that's a consumption tax or a carbon tax. And at the same time, it's also very hard to do any of this without controlling spending. There's really no way to keep up with the growth of spending that's built into the budget. So we should throw away these just ridiculous promises of things we can avoid to deal with the budget and start talking truthfully to voters about there's two pieces here. We have to pay for the things that we want and getting a sense of how much they cost. We have a budget tool called Is It Worth It, where you can look up how much any different program per taxpayer or per household would actually cost. I think it's really interesting. And then the other piece of that is, and what are we going to put in place that helps bring that debt trajectory down, because we cannot stay on the path that we are on. It will do too much damage to the economy and our strength, and it will hurt families in an ever-growing way.
So do you see the federal government ever getting to the point where they actually acknowledge that they're not going to be able to simply tax the rich to be able to fund all of their lavish spending initiatives, that they will eventually have to broaden the tax base and get pretty much every American to pony up? And help me understand a little bit of what your article concluded. You sort of you started off with a really far-fetched 103% on any dollar you made above $400,000, and you slowly brought it down, and it seems like you ended up every dollar made above $50,000 would have to be taxed at a certain level, which seemed to suggest that we're going to have to really broaden the tax base if we're going to be able to sustain all this spending moving forward. Do you see the federal government ever moving to the point where they would, get buy-in from every taxpayer?
Here's the problem. I used to have absolute trust that the government would go through all sorts of political fighting and grandstanding and heartfelt speeches about why they had all the right answers. And then our lawmakers would come together and compromise and do the right thing. And whether that right thing is come up with a budget deal or whether they'd figure out how to finance something. I believed the government worked that way, and I was frustrated that it took so much kind of chest thumping to get there. And I should say all this, I'm a huge political independent, and you can hear throughout my entire way of talking about these things, I'm really frustrated with the political parties. They strike me as second graders who are not doing the job that they should be doing. And I say that as someone who works with a lot of lawmakers who are smart and great and there to do the right thing, and I really admire. So it's not the individuals, it's the way the parties work, and it's the power the parties have over the individuals, and the fact that they spend so much time in the end now not coming up with the right answers. So I used to be fully confident we would get there. I am not. anymore. I am deeply, deeply concerned for not just our kids, but for us, that our lawmakers are now so intent on meeting the desires of the extremes, the new kind of influencer economy, where being so extreme and out there on themselves, they're having influence through their own platforms instead of through kind of rolling up their sleeves and doing good governance. All the things that it would take to come up with a compromise that we need to do, I do not believe enough of them are willing to do it, or the party leaders are willing to do it, or trust each other enough to do it. They have to build the trust back to get there. So I'm really concerned it's not a given. What it should involve is we waited way too long. If we hadn't postponed this, we would have had much easier choices to get to where we need to go. But we're now going to need not only to scale back a lot of our promises and forego a lot of the new things we'd like to do, we're going to need probably another revenue source. And that means adding on to the taxes we have a broad-based tax, which could either be a sales tax like a VAT, like they have in Europe, or a carbon tax that you could raise an awful lot of money on. And there are lots of other taxes that are out there, ideas like wealth tax and estate taxes, and a bunch of different things, which would be adding on to different forms of income and savings. There may be pieces for those as well. Another kind of tax policy that I think is really promising is we have tremendous amounts of tax breaks. Every year we lose about $1.8 trillion in revenues from credits and deductions and exclusions. We could get rid of a lot of those. That could raise a good deal of money. So I think we'll need one of those big taxes, consumption, carbon, or broadening the tax base, like I just said, with those tax breaks. But I'm not sure how we're getting there through the leadership that we need. I don't see it happening anytime soon, because if anyone brought it up, they would just get pounded on by the other party and many members of their own party. So the solutions are there. You put a bunch of people with very different views about their preferences, but a willingness to compromise and work together in a room, we could hash out a budget blueprint that would get this country into sound fiscal position in a matter of days. But I don't think our politicians are working in that system anymore, and that's what concerns me, not just for this problem, but for all the other hard, long-term, really difficult issues in which there needs to be compromise that they're failing to work on.
Okay, so that was part one of my interview with Maya MacGuineas, president of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Once again, if you are looking for help in insulating yourself against the potential for rising taxes and a lot of the things that we discussed in today's podcast, head on over to davidmcknight.com. If you are an advisor who would like to do likewise for your clients, head over to powerzero.com. Once again, I would love a follow on Twitter. By the way, if you have not yet seen our movie, The Power Zero, The Tax Train is Coming, Maya MacGuineas stars in it. And so that's actually how we met Maya MacGuineas for the very first time. You can go watch that. If you are a financial advisor, you can watch it for free at thetaxtrain.com. If you're not a financial advisor, you can watch it anywhere you stream movies. All right, folks, we will look forward to chatting with you same time next week where we will listen to the second part of my interview with Maya MacGuineas. Talk to you then.